if you can hear me. All right, we are live on Facebook. It's so good to see everyone here for our prepping for Pesach class. I'm really excited to be back in town to see everyone's faces, at least virtually, digitally. And yeah, hoping to see you all in person as well. So, Pesach, very exciting holiday with a lot of meaning to it. And this class is we're going to try our best to make this a catch-all class to try and prepare ourselves as much as we can for Pesach. We're going to speak about the meaning of the holiday. We're going to focus on the Seder, the meaning of the Seder, the meaning of some of our customs, but primarily we're going to be focusing on the actual procedure of the Seder to help us review, refresh, and prepare, and hopefully go into Pesach with a little more insight and inspiration. A lot of us are making Pesach in unique circumstances this year because this is a year of unique circumstances, or the second year actually. Last year Pesach was like this too. So hopefully the insights that we discuss in this class will help us all approach it with a fresh pair of eyes. So before we begin, let's speak a little bit about what Pesach means in general. We know that Pesach commemorates something that happened, many thousands of years ago, but Pesach is also something which is relevant to us now, as my father likes to say, and it's all over the works of Chassidus, that the freedom that we experienced on Pesach, the original Pesach, is something that we can experience now in our own lives. We all have things that hold us back, and things that we feel trapped, we feel imprisoned, we feel enslaved. But Pesach is a time when we have a certain godly energy which is present, which can allow us to transcend our own limitations. We're going to speak about this a little bit more. So before we begin the class, I think everyone should take a moment to ask yourself, what are some things that you feel in your own life are holding you back? Your own personal Egypt, your own personal Mitzrayim, whether it's a habit that you can't shake or something else like that. What is something you wish to become free of? And sort of visualize that in your head and realize that Pesach is an opportunity God is giving us to work towards a more liberated, more enlightened, more inspired version of ourselves. I just want to confirm, everyone can hear me, right? If you can, just nod if you can hear me. Excellent. All right. Perfect. Okay. So, there's a famous story they tell about Pesach, because Pesach is a holiday where everyone comes together, where families come together. It's a famous story about an elderly couple living in Phoenix, Arizona, and one day the father calls one of his kids who lives in Chicago. He says, "Jaime, how are you? Your mother and I have decided 45 years is enough to suffer. We're getting a divorce." So Jaime in Chicago is like, "Dad, wait a minute, what?" And his father says, "Yeah, don't try and talk us out of it. This has been going on for weeks. We've been talking about it, and enough is enough. That's it. We can't go any further. We can't live this anymore. We're divorcing." Jaime says, "Dad, hang on." He calls up his sister, Clara, in Washington, D.C. He calls her up because, "Clara, this is what the parents are. They're crazy." Clara gets on the phone and she calls them immediately. She says, "Mom, Dad, don't do a thing. We're flying down to you. Do not do a thing till we get there." She slams down the phone. And in Phoenix, the father turns to his wife and says, "Okay, they're coming for Passover and paying their own airfares." So it's a holiday which is very much associated with family coming together. And throughout history, Jews have done amazing, incredible things to commemorate the holiday under the toughest circumstances. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation with you all. Let me know if you can see it. If you can see it, just nod your head. All right. So the first slide we have over here is a little interesting story about Passover in concentration camp. We're going to read it over here. You guys can see it? If you can see it, please nod. So I can see it. All right. So this was in the Vaihingen concentration camp. I'm definitely not pronouncing that right. In Pesach of 1943, one camp resident, Moshe Prur, related, "The people in camp are already used to the miserable situation. They saw death before their eyes, but they asked, where could we get flour? How could we bake matzah? Shortly before Passover, one of the SS men in camp entered my workshop where I painted signs. He asked me to make dummy targets for target practice. Just then, an idea flashed through my mind. I claimed that I would need flour, lots of flour. to paste the pictures of soldiers on the targets. He asked how much flour. I said I would need 5 kilograms. I'm an American man. I have no clue how much a kilogram is, but probably a lot. He liked my suggestion and immediately gave me the appropriate referral. The Jews of the Vahingi concentration camp went to work baking the matzah in secret, even though they knew they would die if they were caught. They baked the matzah in the oven in Pearl's workroom, keeping the door and windows sealed. When the night of the Seder came, 20 Jews managed to pull off a Seder in a concentration camp in 1943. Aside from the matzah, they ate potatoes and drank homemade wine, which consisted of water and sugar. They even managed to read the Haggadah. When the Nazis succeeded in destroying so many Jewish lives, they failed to destroy the Jewish life from these Jews on that Passover. So it's not just, people coming together in family reunion time, which is beautiful, but this is something which is very essential to who we are as Jews and our national identity. I myself was just reading an account of a Jew who suffered very much in the concentration camps, in the Gulag in Russia. His name was Lazer Nanis, a legendary chassid. He was in the Gulag for 20 years, and every one of those 20 years, every Pesach, he would have a whole nother Ganze Megillah, a whole story, hardships trying to get matzah and trying to get food for Pesach because he refused to eat chametz. So Pesach is a very, very important Yom Tov. Now, a lot of us are celebrating Pesach, as I said before, in unusual circumstances. Some people, I know that I'm personally used to growing up with our big community Seder, which is a beautiful event. Everyone comes together, usually on the first night, we have a Seder together. And this time, most of us are going to be making the Seder in our own houses. But it's interesting to note, historically, that actually the first Seder ever, which was the night before the Exodus, that was the exact situation the Jews were in. The Torah told the Jews, Hashem told the Jews to quarantine in their houses. It was just families together. There was no friends. You could not leave your house until the morning. This was the night when the death of the firstborn was taking place. And it was dangerous to walk outside. And it was just the Jews themselves with their immediate family. And one of the reasons that is given for why this was because the Jews were about to become a nation. They were about to gain their national identity. They were about to be, sort of inaugurated as God's people. And before you establish a nation, nations have a tendency to swallow up individuals, right? The greater good, precedes the needs of the individual. And God wanted the Jews to remember and treasure their individuality and their relationships with their families before you enter into this big national, bigger than yourself endeavor. And, I'm not sure this is written anywhere, but I know that the Rebbe always told us we're right on the cusp of Mashiach. So I guess it's not too far-fetched to say that maybe something like that is taking place now. The reason we have to, we have to be so distant from our friends may have something to do with some sort of preparation for Mashiach. Now, an important note is, we're able to speak over Zoom, and some of you may have, may be interested in making a Seder over Zoom, but I would recommend to do the Seder beforehand and to do the Zoom beforehand before Yom Tov starts, because making any kind of online or electric connection like that is discouraged on the holidays. Now, besides for commemorating something that happened, Kabbalistically, the Seder night is actually something which is going on right now. When you think about it, think about all the special places that we have in the world. We know that Jerusalem is a very holy city, and the site of the Holy Temple, in Jerusalem itself, where the Kotel is a very holy place. And we understand that concept, that there could be certain places which are charged with a spiritual energy. But the same way that exists in space, that also exists in time. There are certain times which have a certain energy to them. And Kabbalah explains that that's how it is with Passover and with all the Jewish holidays. We're not just commemorating something that happened. The reason the Jews were redeemed on the 15th of the Jewish month of Nisan was because there was a certain energy in the world which predisposed this day to be a day of redemption. There was an atmosphere of redemption in the air, if you can say. And that same aura, that same feeling of redemption exists every year on the 15th day of Pesach, which is why, as we're going to see later, it's a day which is especially propitious for the coming of Mashiach. That's why we set a cup for Elijah the prophet, who will herald the coming of Mashiach. So think about this. It makes our Seder much more real and much more relatable, because we're not just remembering something, and we're not just recalling something that happened thousands of years ago, even if we can apply lessons to ourselves, but still, it happened a long time ago. It's something that's going on right now. And we're trying to tap into this spiritual energy. Now, because we're trying to tap into a spiritual energy, there are very specific ways of doing that. Imagine typing a URL. When you're typing a URL or an email address, if you're off by even one letter, then you're not going to get your mail is not going to get to the right place. It's going to go to someone else or not get sent at all. And you may think, one letter doesn't make a difference. One dot doesn't make a difference. Well, when you're trying to access something very specific, and when this address you're writing is not just a string of words, but it's like a key that leads you to somewhere else, you want to make sure you follow everything to a T. So that's why the Seder, people say the Seder is so ritualized. You do this, you do that, you lean here, as we're going to see, you have a cup, drink the cup of wine here, you pour the cup of wine, you don't drink it. It seems to go against, why don't I just do what I feel is the most inspiring to me and gives me the greatest feeling of freedom. And that's because, as important as it is, and we're going to see, this is very important, to feel inspired ourselves, the thing we have to think about first is the formula that God and Jewish law and Jewish tradition sets forth for us, which allows us to type in this URL, so to speak, and access and tune in to this feeling of freedom. And there's a very interesting story associated with that, which involves a man named Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel was a very pious individual. He lived many, many years ago in Russia, and he was a very, very poor man. I believe that was very popular in Russia at the time. And he had a principle that he would never ask anybody for money. He would only accept if somebody offered him, if they noticed his poverty and they offered to help him, then he would accept it. But under normal circumstances, he would never solicit anybody's help. This was his policy, and his family respected it. Now, it was before Pesach, before Passover, and no one had really noticed him. Everyone was busy with their own holiday preparations, so nobody had ever offered him anything for the holidays, and he was destitute. He had nothing in his house. So it was Erev Pesach, the day before Pesach. He was davening the Mincha prayer. It was the afternoon. And, he's crying bitter tears to God, please send someone to help me. His Rebbe, his spiritual leader, was the Chose of Lublin, the seer of Lublin. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a very holy man. He was called the seer because he possessed a vision. He could see very far away, and he could understand things other people couldn't. He felt the pain of this chassid, and he dispatched another one of his followers to bring this Rav Shmuel everything he needed for the holiday. So the man, who was pretty well off, he loaded up a wagon with holiday supplies, and he reached Rav Shmuel, just as the holiday was about to come in, and they set up a whole Seder. And that Seder night, Rav Shmuel's table was glowing. His whole family was there. All his kids were there. His wife was there. He was so inspired that God helped him out. And the Seder went till very, very late, but nobody was impatient because they were enjoying the spiritual meditations, and he was saying stories, and it was just a glorious, beautiful experience. As a matter of fact, it went so late that he never even got a chance to sleep. He was in a state of spiritual excitement. The first day of Pesach, after the first Seder, he goes to shul, and the whole day he's in synagogue, he's in shul, praying and thanking God for saving him. And finally, the eve of the second Seder, after almost 2 full days of being awake, it starts to catch up to him. That does happen, I know from experience. And he decides to lie down for a little nap, and he tells his wife, please wake me up, in an hour so we can start the Seder. But of course, his wife and his kids have some mercy on him because they know he's exhausted. They let him sleep a little bit longer. And he ends up waking up somewhere around 11:30 at night. And the Afikomen, which we're going to see is one of the last steps of the Seder, eating the Afikomen, the bigger half of the middle Matzah, which we broke in the Seder, is supposed to be done before midnight. And Rabbi Shmuel was very careful with every detail of Jewish law. So he wakes up 11:30. What? 11:30 in a rush. He's like, oh my gosh, I woke up so late. He plows through the Seder like it's like the world is ending. He goes to gulps down the cups of wine, and he gets those matzahs down his throat. He eats the Marror, and he finally makes it in time for the Afikomen. No inspiration, no singing, no telling stories. Boom, just knock down the Seder. And the next day, he feels very, very brokenhearted, What I could have had, I had supplies to have such a beautiful Seder again a second night. And instead, I had this rushed version of the Seder. And he was feeling very down. He started to cry. And the next day, Chol HaMoed, or the day after next day, which is Chol HaMoed, when you're allowed to travel, he decided to go to his mentor, to the seer of Lublin. And as soon as he walked into his room, before he even had a chance to tell him, the seer starts talking as if he's talking to himself. He says, let's think about Rav Shmuel's two Seders. The seer says to himself. The first Seder was with fiery enthusiasm. And it was very beautiful. But at the end of the day, it didn't cause such a ruckus up in heaven. But his second Seder was done with a broken heart. And that deemed this Seder extraordinary. In other words, when you want to talk about spiritual inspiration and meaning and excitement, God has many, many angels who could probably do that way better than us because they understand God better than us. But when it comes to dedication to fulfilling a mitzvah and to doing God's commandments the way he wanted them to, this an angel cannot do. Only we can do that. Only Jews can carry out God's will and fulfill the mitzvahs and keep the Torah in the realm of physical action. So I think what the Chozah, this message he was sending to the student was, your Seder was precious because you showed how much it matters to you, not just to feel inspired, but to do what God wants you to on a practical level. So I think it's something we should keep in mind as we go about learning and preparing for the Seder, that we want to feel inspired, we want to understand the deeper meaning, but the main thing is we want to connect to God in the way he told us to, by having a Pesach Seder according to Jewish law. All right, let's move on to our next slide. Now, if you want to understand the makeup of the Seder and how it evolved, throughout history, it evolved in various ways to become the Seder that we understand now, that we see now. Seder, by the way, means an order, a sequence. There's 14 steps, which we're going to speak about later. We have to realize that the Seder is actually a bunch of different elements which we have to take care of on the first night of Pesach. And our rabbis, many thousands of years ago, compiled this order, this sequence of events to kind of check all these boxes. So let's speak about first, before we speak about the actual Seder, some of the boxes, so to speak, that we have to check. Some of the things you're supposed to do on the night of Pesach, the anniversary of the Exodus from Egypt. Now, first of all, there's a mitzvah. There is a commandment from the Torah to retell the story of the Exodus. Arguably, this would be the main mitzvah of tonight. In the Talmud, the Seder is usually referred to as this: telling over the mitzvah, telling over the story of the Exodus, And this is from a pasuk, a verse in the Torah, and you should tell your son on that day, saying, because of this, God did this for me when I went out of Egypt. That is one of the main themes of the Seder. That's why in Maggid, which we're going to speak about a little later, we tell the story of Exodus at length. Now, specifically, when we are telling the story, we want to begin on a low and end on a high. So, as we're going to see, when we're telling the story, we start off on a big, big low. We start by saying how our ancestors worshipped idols. Abraham, we like to make a big deal about Abraham, our forefather, but his father was Terach, who wasn't such a rock star, spiritually speaking. He served idols. So we keep ourselves humble. We start off on a low, and we, both on the spiritual realm, we explain how we climbed higher and higher in our relationship to God, and also physically, we say how we recount how we started off as slaves, and God took us higher and higher until we became his chosen people, and we were living the high life in the desert. Now, number 3. Next, the Seder is structured in questions and answers. This is a very important recurring theme that we find in the Seder, because when the Torah instructs us to tell our children about it, it's framed specifically in a question and answer format. It says over here, you should tell your son on this day that God did this when you went out of Egypt, and the previous verse says how the son is questioning. He's asking, what are these things you're doing? So throughout the Seder, we actually do strange and unusual things specifically for the purpose of getting our children to ask. And it's a very important insight we're going to speak about a little later, how things stick with people, and especially with children, when instead of hitting them over the head with a hammer and saying, remember this, we make them ask, we pique their curiosity. So those are more of the thematic elements. Then there's also some very practical things. First of all, the mitzvah to eat matzah. Straight up, God told us in the Torah, on the first month, the 14th day of the month in the evening, which is when the Seder night is, you should eat unleavened cakes until the 21st day of the month. So from the simple reading of the verse, it sounds like you're eating them for all 8 days of Passover. But in tractate Pesachim, which is the tractate of the Talmud, which deals with the laws of Passover, the sages learn that this is only on the first night, the first day of Passover, there is a mitzvah. And if anybody wants to learn with me that page of Gemara, it's very, very interesting, but it's beyond the scope of this class. Besides for the mitzvah to eat matzah, we also have the mitzvah to eat the Korban Pesach, the Pesach offering. Back when the Jews had the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, they would bring a lamb, and they would slaughter it on the afternoon before Pesach, and they would roast it. There are many, many laws involved with the Pesach offering. Unfortunately, nowadays we can no longer do this, and we do many things, as we're going to see, to remember it and to commemorate it. But that is something else that we want to mention and we want to remember on the night of the Seder. And so, yeah, here's a little bit more about the Pesach Lamb, a little bit more of the scriptural sources. The 10th of this month, everyone has to take a lamb for every home, and they should keep it until the 14th. They kept the lamb for 4 days in Egypt. All right, that's the last slide for this section, but there's a few other things. There's also a mitzvah to have 4 cups of wine, and this is actually not a Torah obligation. The rabbis established that in the Seder you should have 4 cups of wine, because wine suggests and represents freedom. Free people drink wine, a very expansive kind of way. And wine in general is linked to holiness. And besides for that, there are many other things we do the night of the Seder which are related to Pesach being a holiday. So we light candles the way we do on every holiday. We say Kiddush like we do on every holiday. We have a meal, which we're going to get to later, which is, these are things you do on every one of the 3 main holidays, on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. All right, so now let's look at the Seder plate, which we have over here. Interestingly enough, this particular Seder plate is a rigid silver, it looks like, or metal plate. The Chabad custom is to use a cloth one, which makes it interesting when the egg starts to roll off. But we got this silver one up here. So the top of the Seder plate over here, we have on our top right and top left, we have the roasted shank bone and the egg. Now, Talmudically, the sages instituted that on your Pesach table you should have 2 cooked objects to remember the 2 main dishes, so to speak, of the Pesach meal back when the Jews were able to bring the sacrifices. There was the Korban Pesach, the Pesach Lamb, and there was also the Korban Chagiga, which was another offering you were supposed to bring just for the Yom Tov. And you can imagine how it was back then. You would have these two sacrificed sheep, families would get together, and it would be a whole festive meal. So to remember that, we eat 2 cooked or roasted objects. Now, why specifically a shank bone and an egg? We'll focus on the shank bone first. The shank bone represents the Korban Pesach, and originally the custom was to use the leg of a sheep, because the Korban Pesach, the Pesach offering, was a sheep too. But eventually, the rabbis instituted that we don't want anyone to get the mistaken idea that we're still offering a Pesach sacrifice, even though there's no Beis HaMikdash. That's not allowed according to Jewish law. So instead, we use the leg of a chicken or the wing of a chicken. Chabad custom is to use the neck of a chicken, and as well, the custom is to burn it or to roast it so much that there's no flesh left, so nobody thinks that we're eating it. It's purely symbolic. And the reason that it's, the people who use a shank bone, they use an arm, is because the word for it is zroa. We call it a zroa. Zroa means an arm, and it brings to mind the verse in the Torah which says that God took us out b'zroa netuya, with an outstretched arm. It's a metaphor for God's strength, how he showed himself. And on the left, we have an egg, which represents the Korban Chagiga. And the reason we chose an egg, there's a few reasons, but one of them is that the Aramaic word for egg is beah. The Hebrew-speaking people in the audience will know that you call an egg in Hebrew a beitzah, and in Aramaic, all the tzaddiks turns into an ayin for reasons unknown. So beah in Aramaic sounds like the Aramaic word for desire or will, and it brings to mind how God desired to bring the Jews out of Egypt. Also, eggs are a traditional food which are used for mourners, and like I said before, on the holidays like Pesach, it becomes even more, it brings to mind the fact that we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, we can't offer the sacrifices that we're supposed to be, so in a way, it like accentuates the mourning that we don't have a Beis HaMikdash anymore, we don't have our holy temple. So we have an egg to sort of comfort us, because an egg is round, it symbolizes, roundish, it's not a perfect circle, but it symbolizes the cycle of life and death. All right. Oh, wow, I didn't know there was these circles. Okay. Now we have the middle top and the middle bottom, which are the Marror herbs. And the mitzvah to eat bitter herbs on the Seder night, if we would have had a Pesach offering, it would have been a mitzvah from the Torah, because the Torah's commandment is to eat the Marror, to eat the bitter herbs together with the Pesach offering. But now that we don't, the rabbis instituted that we should eat it anyways as a remembrance. So thank you, rabbis. We'll enjoy that. There's two, because we eat Marror at 2 points in the Seder. One time we eat the Marror plain for the step which is called Marror, and then later on, as we're going to see, we eat it in a sandwich. Now, what exactly should you use for Marror? There are two principal things that are used nowadays, either romaine lettuce or horseradish. And romaine lettuce is not bitter, but it becomes bitter if you leave it in the ground. Leave it in the ground for long enough, I'm told it becomes bitter. I never verified it, but I trust them. And actually, romaine lettuce, for that reason, is preferable, because the Jews' bitter exile in Egypt followed that same pattern. At first, the Egyptians told them, come work for us, we'll give you a chance to participate in our building project, to beautify the land of Egypt. And eventually the Jews were sucked in. At first it was all sweet talk, but then they were enslaved. Contrary to popular belief, horseradish actually became prevalent because the Jews in Europe did not have access to romaine lettuce. So that's why horseradish is still used, because it became customary. But romaine lettuce is actually better if you get your hands on it. And nowadays, in our modern times, thank God we can. All right, bottom right, we have the charoset, the mortar-like paste. And what particular recipe you use for charoset depends on where you're from. There are, some people use apples, pears, dates, pomegranates, walnuts. I hear people use cinnamon and ginger. It's really up to your family custom. The Chabad custom is to use a simple recipe of apples, pears, and walnuts. And at the Seder night itself, right before we eat it, we add a little bit of wine, typically from our cup. And of course, the charoset, as you can see, symbolizes the mortar, which the Jews used during their slavery to build construction projects for the Egyptians. That was part of their slavery, so we commemorate it visually with the charoset. Actually, the word charoset is related to the Hebrew word cheres, which means like a clay pottery jug, which is related to that. All right, bottom left, we have our karpas vegetable, which we dip in the salt water, as we're going to see a little bit later on in the Seder. We're going to find out the reason for that. Now, really, the karpas could be any vegetable. The Chabad custom is to use either a potato or a cooked potato or a raw onion. And I remember when my grandfather, who, God bless him, he should live long, he's from Russia, he used a raw onion, and we were all very impressed by that. But we used cooked potato because we can't really do that. But you could also use parsley or cabbage, parsnips, radishes. There's all sorts of customs. And again, use your own family custom if you have one. And under the hood, we have our 3 matzahs. There's 3 matzahs corresponding to the 3 sections the Jewish people are split into: the Kohen, the Levi, and the Yisrael. And the best kind of matzah to use, of course, is the one you see in front of you, the shmura matzah, which is distinguished from machine matzah in 3 ways. It's handmade, it's guarded, the wheat, it's shmura means guarded in Hebrew. The wheat is meticulously washed to make sure that no moisture gets onto it, because we're afraid that if even a little moisture gets onto the flour or the wheat at any point in the process, it could become chametz, it could become leaven. So the only time the wheat is brought into contact with water is once it's already been ground into flour. You mix it with water, and then quickly you knead it into a dough, and within 18 minutes it's baked into these lovely, delicious cardboard-like patties. So that is the best shmur matzah, the best kind of be in contact with my father to see about getting your own shmur matzah for your Seder. All right, let's jump into the how-to of the Seder itself. So the Seder is split up into 14 steps. We've sort of consolidated them together a little bit for to kind of have a clear understanding of the flow. But as I go along, I'll be pointing out the names of each of these steps. If you've been to our Seder, you'll recognize them. Before the Seder starts, we actually read them all out together. Before the Seder starts, we have, as you see in front of you, candle lighting. As I said before, Pesach is a holiday, just like Sukkot, Shavuot, and as such, the women light the Yom Tov, the holiday candles. there are two blessings that are said on the candles. One of them is, I'll switch to the English, and over here you see a transliteration as well. And if you have a Haggadah, those blessings should be in there. One of them, the first one is thanking God for giving us the mitzvah of lighting the holiday lights. The second one is the famous Shechianu bracha, thanking God for enabling us to reach this occasion. All right, the first step of the Seder. In the 14 steps, this is called Kaddish, to make Kiddush. And like I said before, Pesach is a holiday, and on every holiday, as well as on Shabbat, we make Kiddush. We sanctify the day over a cup of wine, and if you can't have wine, you can use grape juice as well, but wine is preferable. Now, unlike on Shabbat, where the leader of the meal makes Kiddush for everyone, by the Seder, everybody makes Kiddush, and typically they do it in unison. And this is the first of the 4 cups. Now, the cup for Kiddush, technically speaking, let's get a little bit detail over here. The cup should be at least 3.2 ounces. That's the equivalent of the revius, which is the halachic amount. And also, it's preferable to use a cup which is not like a cheap styrofoam or paper cup, to use something which, people have custom to use, silver or metal, something a little bit respectable. Now, we fill the cup to overflowing. You'll notice in this picture that the cup is not overflowing. There's no Kabbalistic reason before that. The photographer, I guess, didn't want to get the table dirty. But we fill the cup to overflowing, which is a representation of our overflowing blessings. You make the Kiddush, and the text of the Kiddush is found in the Haggadah. And when you are finished saying the Kiddush, you drink the cup, and you're supposed to drink the majority of the cup, or at least 1.6 ounces. Now, by the drinking of this cup, as by all the 4 cups and by the matzah, we lean to our left side to show freedom, because free people, especially in the olden days, they would eat leaning. This is called haseba. It's a very big detail of the Seder, a visual representation of freedom. And it's important to lean to your left side, not to your right side, because the Rambam Maimonides pointed out that if you lean to the right, there's a choking risk. All right, we wash the hands. This is the step of Orchatz, the second step of the Seder. We wash our hands before we dip the vegetable in the salt water. And this is a callback to, again, the temple times when ritual impurity was a very important detail of people's lives, because when you have sacrifices, you can only eat them if your hands are pure. And there was a lot of details of purity. People often had to wash their hands and go dip in the mikvah for different things. So when you're eating a wet vegetable, halachically, a wet vegetable is susceptible to impurity. So before people would eat anything, and even nowadays, before people eat anything which is dipped in something else which is wet, you wash your hands, but we do not make a blessing like we usually do, because we're not washing for bread. We're washing as a callback to the ritual impurity back in the temple times. Karpas, this is a famous one. A lot of people remember this one. We take our vegetable, in this case it looks like parsley, and we dip it into the salt water. The salt water represents the tears of our ancestors as they went about their hard work. Why do we dip our vegetable into salt water? And the answer is that the children should ask. As we mentioned before, questions and answers are a very big part of the Seder. We want children to be interested and to be, they want to arouse their curiosity. So we do this entire ritual. Usually after you make Kiddush, what do? You have a meal. You go straight into the meal. But no, we divert and we go and have this strange ritual. And the point is to get the children asking. Now, when they do ask, this is going to be the answer. The answer was just that you should ask. But we want to get them comfortable. Too often as adults, we, kids ask a lot of questions, and sometimes we don't always want to hear them. We want to get them in a mood where they feel comfortable and relaxed to ask their questions, because that is the point of the night. We want the kids to get involved, we want them to ask questions. There was a scientist. His name was Isidore Rabbi. I think I'm pronouncing it right. And he grew up in Brooklyn, or in Europe somewhere, and he described how his mother taught him to be a scientist. So a lot of kids, they would come home and their mother would say, "What did you learn today?" And his mother, when he would come home, his mother would ask him, "Did you ask any good questions today?" So in Judaism, questions are encouraged, and we're not, we don't discourage them. We want people to ask lots of questions. Now, even if you have no kids present at your Seder, try and arouse the child in you. Sometimes as we grow out of childhood our natural curiosity becomes stifled. Try and reconnect with that. All right, before we go on to Maggid, we have Yachatz. So if you're keeping track, we had Kadesh, Orchatz, Karpas, the first three, and now we're up to the fourth, Yachatz. We break the middle matzah of the three matzahs. The smaller piece is put back into the Seder plate. The bigger piece is put aside to become the Afikomen, which we're going to eat a little bit later. And the meaning of breaking the matzah is called poor man's bread. It was the bread that, nowadays it's actually pretty expensive because we have to be careful that it shouldn't become chametz. But the basic idea of matzah, it's got no eggs, no sugar, no oil. It's just literally water and flour. It's the egg that poor people historically ate. So we take our matzah and we break it, we make it even poorer because, there's two kinds. There's poor people who have at least a whole bread, even if it's poor man's bread. There's people who can't even afford an entire loaf of bread. So as we've said before, we want to start at a very low point and then work our way up. So we start off at the lowest point, we break our middle matzah, making it the poorest of poor men's bread. Now, before we begin Maggid, telling over the story, which is the fifth step, we pour ourselves, we don't drink, we pour the second cup. And throughout Maggid, this second cup is going to be sitting in front of us, just like when you make Kiddush, you're saying the prayer with the wine in front of you. In halachic terms, this is called saying the Kiddush over the wine. So we say Maggid over the wine as well, and at the end of Maggid, we're going to drink it. We start off Maggid with the 4 questions. These are the questions that the kids ask about several things that they've seen so far on this very confusing night, and some of the things they see on the table. They ask why we're dipping the karpas, they ask why we're eating only matzah, why we're leaning when we're drinking, and why we have these bitter herbs on the table in front of us. It's a very weird setup. And even if you don't have any children there, you ask the Manashtana yourself, because again, we want to get ourselves in that kind of mood. Now, Maggid is the step where we really fulfill the bulk of the story of the Exodus, which we mentioned is one of the biggest points of the Seder night. And we don't have time to go through the exact Haggadah, the entire Haggadah right now. I encourage you to look through your Haggadah before the Seder to familiarize yourself with it. But we follow this same pattern. We start off on a very low point, describing how our ancestors served idols, and later on the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, and we begin to speak about the 10 plagues and how God took us out. Now, if you're not able to go through the entire narrative with your family on the Seder night, it would be good to go through before and try and find a few highlights. I would suggest Avadim Hayinu, which, kind of describes in a nutshell, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God took us out. The 4 sons is a very interesting portion of the Seder with a lot of lessons for us. Vihisha Amda, another famous one, where we speak about how God saved us through whatever we went through, whatever we were faced with in our history. God ultimately freed us and saved us. And we list off the 10 plagues, and we pour off a little bit of wine from our cup by each of the 10 plagues to show that even though these plagues were, they were inflicted on the wicked Egyptians who made us suffer so much, we still don't like the suffering or death of any human being or any living being. It's a tragedy. So we pour a little bit of wine as an indication that, we're a little bit sad that this happened. We'd rather this whole thing, went over peacefully. And of course, Dayenu, who could forget Dayenu? It's a beloved childhood song, which will get stuck in your head. Warning. And there's a few other parts of the Haggadah that I encourage you all to look inside. After we finish telling over the story of the Exodus, we segue into Hallel, into praising God for taking us out of Egypt. You may recognize the Hallel from on Rosh Chodesh, and on holidays we say the Hallel, and it's a few chapters of Tehillim, which again are full of praise for God for everything He does for us. The end of Maggid is the blessing, and after that we make a blessing and we drink the second cup of wine in the same way we drank the first one. We lean to the side, try and drink at least 1.6 ounces or most of the cup. All right, this is the Manashtana we spoke about. All right, that was Maggid. The next step is Motzi and Matzah. Motzi is when you make the blessing of a Motzi. We wash our hands. And actually, there's Rachza, which is the step when we wash our hands, and this time we make a blessing. Asher Kichanu Mitzvos V'Tivanu Al Netilas Yadayim. No, it doesn't look like they have a text of blessing here. It's in the Haggadah. We take the matzah and we make a blessing of hamotzi, and we also make a blessing on al achilat matzah, thanking God for giving us the mitzvah of matzah. And this mitzvah is a biblical mitzvah. The same mitzvah the Jews had in Egypt to eat matzah, we have that same mitzvah nowadays. And you eat the matzah again while reclining. And the proper amount to eat is at least half of an average-sized shmur matzah. I know it's hard, but that is the mitzvah. So try your best to eat at least half of a average shmur matzah. Now I'm going to jump in here with a little bit of an insight. The two main players at the Seder are the wine and the matzah. We're eating a lot of those. And it's interesting that wine and matzah represent two different sides of a coin. And we touched on this before. Wine is something which has a very complex flavor. You know, it's very savory, very flavorful. We appreciate it, we enjoy it. And matzah, some people enjoy it, but on a very basic level, it's bland, not very sophisticated, it's flat. And these two foods kind of indicate two different ways we could serve God. Sometimes we serve God and we're feeling involved and we're feeling emotional and we're enthusiastic. And sometimes, that's our wine times. And sometimes we're feeling a little flat, a little bland. We don't feel the meaning, and yet we still do it, even though we're not necessarily feeling up to it. And they're both very important parts of serving God, because the matzah part is very important because it shows God our commitment. Not just on the good days are we dedicated to you, but even when it's not going so great, I'm not feeling my best, I'm still doing what you told me to. But on the other hand, the wine is also very important because you're getting involved, you're excited, you're enthusiastic. So both of these things are necessary, and that's why we have a lot of it on the Seder night. All right, next step is everyone's favorite step, marror, eating the marror. So you take the lettuce and or the horseradish, you dip it into the charoses. Contrary to what a lot of people think or like to think, you're not supposed to pile tons of charoset on there, even though it might help kill the taste. It's not supposed to. That's why you don't do a lot of charoset. You dip it in a little, and then you're actually supposed to shake it off because you want to get that full bitter experience. And by the way, the marror is not there to make us suffer. The Rabbi explained that the marror accentuates this freedom. Only when you remember how bitter the slavery was and you have some sort of tactile sensory reminder of it, how free we are and how beautiful it is to be able to serve God, especially nowadays, and we have that kind of freedom to be able to do it. We do not recline. We eat the marror because we recline only when we're doing things that evoke freedom, and the marror does not. The next step is the Korech Sandwich, when we eat the matzah and the marror together in the temple times, and we actually make a verbal proclamation of what I'm about to say in Hebrew. There was a great sage named Hallel, and he determined that in the verse, when the Torah tells you to eat the Karpas with matzah and marror, the Torah actually meant to eat them together, not just all on the same table in the same meal, to actually eat them together. To remember that and to take into account his opinion of how it was supposed to be done after we've eaten the matzah and the marror separately, we put them together in a sandwich. We obviously don't have the carbon. That would probably make the whole sandwich a little bit more tasty, but we're stuck with this until Mashiach comes. Hopefully that should be soon, for other reasons, but also for this. All right, and now we have the festive meal. There's a famous story. I'm sure you all heard it about two beggars. There's a Jewish beggar and a non-Jewish beggar, and they're both hungry, and it's before Passover. So the Jewish beggar tells the non-Jewish beggar, you know what, dress up like a Jew, I'll take you to shul, and I'm sure you'll get invited to a Seder, and you'll have something to eat. So sure enough, they get invited to two different meals, and the non-Jewish beggar is, the next day comes back to shul, and the Jewish beggar sees his non-Jewish friend, is like, "No, how was it?" Non-Jewish beggar starts into him, he's like, "It was awful. It was the worst experience of my life. I'm going to pay you back for this. You'll see, this was not funny." And the Jew is like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "I got there. I'm starving. We had a full cup of wine on an empty stomach. You can imagine what I did to my stomach. I figured at least we're going to start eating something. Nope. We got a teeny sliver of vegetable and salt water. And I'm sitting there hungry, and they're reading this and they're reading that. And finally, I think we're gonna have something, and it's like a newspaper, shoving it down my mouth. And then they bring out this lettuce. I'm like, okay, at least a lettuce, but inside there was horseradish. My mouth was on fire. I jumped up, I ran out of there. And the Jewish friend tells him, if you would have waited a couple more minutes, if you would have stuck it out, you would have gotten to the meal. So it's a joke, but it's also a lesson for us. Life is pretty tough, but we try and stick it out, and we will realize that there was a reason for what we went through, and it made us the people that we are. And we are able to enjoy the meal, the smoother sailing afterwards. Now, simply the reason we have a meal is because, as we mentioned before, by the candlelighting and Kiddush, Pesach is a holiday. So every holiday, there's an obligation to have a festive meal involving particularly meat. There's no need to recline throughout the meal. You're allowed to have as many cups of wine as you want, but after the meal, you should keep it to, we've had 2 cups of wine, if you're keeping track, until now, one by Kiddush and one after Maggid. Once the meal is done, it's best to only have the next 2 to keep the, the integrity of the 4-cup of wine thing. The Chabad custom is to eat the egg off of the Seder plate at the beginning of the meal. It's the first thing you eat. We dip it in salt water, and then we have whatever you have during the meal. After the meal, there is the famous Afikomen, and the Afikomen, as we mentioned before, we split the middle matzah in half by yachatz, and this step is called tzafon. We take the Afikomen, which we hid aside, and we eat it. This is the last thing you should have by the meal. And after you've eaten the Afikomen, which is around half a matzah, the bigger half of the matzah you split, you're not supposed to eat anything else or drink anything else besides for the next 2 cups in the Seder. So make sure you're full before you do that. Some people have the custom where the one of the children will steal the Afikomen and the head of the Seder will playfully ransom it back with prizes. In some communities, including in Chabad, this is discouraged, but everyone practices their own customs. It's this diversity which makes the Jewish nation so lovable and so beautiful. All right, so that is the Afikomen. And we're beginning the home stretch of the Seder. We fill the 3rd cup, just like we filled the third 2. We don't drink it yet. At this point, we pour the Korech Sandwich. And those of you who have been by our community Seder, it's a very, very beautiful, and by every Seder, but it's a very beautiful moment. Generally, 2 people will be chosen to take a candle. If the Shabbat candles are still burning, the holiday candles are still burning. We take it to the door and we open the door to greet Eliyahu Hanavi, who visits every single Seder. This particular illustration that you see is an illustration from a children's Haggadah, beloved children's Haggadah that I grew up on, and I think we always thought this was a very intimidating picture, but he looks very regal. Now, why do we open the door for Eliyahu Hanavi? Because, as we mentioned before, Pesach is a holiday which is associated with redemption, and Eliyahu Hanavi, there's many things that are said about him. He was a very special man, and one of his very famous roles is that he's going to be the herald announcing the coming of Mashiach. So we open the door and we pour him a cup of wine in expectation that he should come and tell us, guys, Mashiach is here, and we'll promptly give him a goblet of wine and say, L'chaim Eliyahu. Cheers to Mashiach. After we open the door for Eliyahu, we say a few words. We close the door and we sit down for benching, the grace after meals. And after benching, we drink our 3rd cup. We say another blessing, and we drink our 3rd cup just like the first 2. We say the blessing of Hagafen, and we drink the cup while leaning to the left. We pour the 4th cup and drink it until we finish saying Hallel. Hallel is, as we mentioned before, you say the Hallel again, various verses, various psalms praising God for taking us out of Egypt and for all the miracles he does for us. And there's a few more paragraphs we say that you might recognize from the Shabbat afternoon davening, the Shabbat morning davening. And, just want to mention on the subject of praising God, people have asked, is God so insecure? He needs us to constantly praise him. Like, you're so great, you're so mighty, you're so awesome. Like he doesn't really need us to tell him that. But truthfully, this is for us. When we're saying God's praises, we're trying to remind ourselves of who exactly is showing so much interest in us and who we have the pleasure of serving and whose chosen nation we are. After the Hallel, we recite a blessing, we drink the 4th cup, and we say the famous L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. By next year, this time, we should already be in Yerushalayim. Now, in some editions of the Haggadah, at this point, there is a short line that begins Chasal Seder Pesach, which means we have concluded the Pesach Seder according to its, with all of its customs, everything, we're done. The Chabad custom is not to say it. That's why it's not in any of our Haggadahs, because we never really finish the Haggadah. We never really finish the Seder. We want the inspiration and the freedom that we've experienced to last for our entire year long. So that is next year in Jerusalem. Beautiful. That is a little overview of the procedure of the Seder, of the Matzah B'Poel, the action. And I just want to conclude with speaking a little bit about what the meaning of the Pesach Seder is and what we're supposed to be feeling. Like we said before, Seder night is a night which is connected very much with redemption. It's a night that God redeemed the Jews, and it's a night that we have a chance to go out of our own limitations, to go out of our own Egypts, and become somebody we never dreamed we could be. The Jews, when Moshe told them that he was going to take them out of Egypt, and this is the beginning, before the 10 plagues, they didn't even listen to him because they were so entrenched in their situation, they were so hopeless, they didn't believe, they couldn't even fathom the idea that they could be redeemed someday. And here we are, thousands of years later, still commemorating this great miracle God did for us. So no matter how it might feel, that we're in a situation which we can never get out of, or there's something that we can never do, but we can take inspiration from the Pesach story to always have hope and to try and ask God to redeem us from whatever it is that we're going through. And I want to end with one story from Rabbi Shlomo Kunin, who is the director of Chabad on the West Coast. When he was still a young man, the Lubavitcher Rebbe would give out matzah, hand-baked schneer matzah on Erev Pesach, on the day before Passover. And the Rebbe gave Rabbi Kunin, who was, again, then a young bacharol, a young man, he gave him a packet of matzah, and he told him to deliver it to a certain address in the Bronx where he lived. So Rabbi Kunin describes he was on his way there. It was late on the day of Erev Pesach, and his train breaks down. He's in the middle of the Bronx, quite a long way from home, and there was no phones. This was in 1958. So he's asking people for directions, and he remembers there was one guy who told him, buddy, you got a long way to go. So that was very helpful. He's trudging through the Bronx. He finally arrives at this address, which is in a housing project. He knocks on the door, and he's greeted by this pot-bellied man with tattoos. And the guy's like, yeah, who are you? Which is the proper greeting in the Bronx when someone knocks on their door. And Rabbi Kunin said, I'm from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He sent me. And the man's face changes. He says, oh, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Come in. And as he's walking in, Rabbi Kunin realizes that there's a big loaf of bread on the table, which is not exactly your Pesach preparations that you're going to want, because we can't have chametz on Pesach. But Rabbi Kunin says he sees that this man is clearly not really ready to have his own Seder, so he decides we're going to sit down, we're going to have a Seder here. The man's wife walks in, and she's very obviously pregnant, and behind her is their two daughters who are both blind, 5 and 6-year-old daughters, and they're trailing behind their mother. And Rabbi Kunin sits down, and he didn't expect to be having this whole Seder. He has no Haggadahs, he's got no wine. They have the matzah, so they have cups of water to sort of stand in as the cups of wine. And he starts, as we say, bringing with them. He starts talking to them. He tells them, some of the things we discussed about how Pesach is all about freedom. God can take us out of our own Egypts. And he goes through the whole Seder as much as he can. He puts his hat on the man's head. They say the blessings, and they eat the matzah. And as they continue talking until 1 a.m. As the man is showing him out, the man tells him, let me tell you why you're here. Me and my wife, he says, we have a genetic disease that our children are born blind. And we had 2 daughters who are blind, as you can see. And when my wife became pregnant again, the doctors advised us not to go through with it, not to have the baby, because there was a virtual certainty the baby would be born blind. So this man worked as a tanner in a meat processing factory, and there was a rabbi who worked as a kashrut supervisor, and he was close to this man. So the man asked the rabbi, what do you think I should do? And the man told him, write to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he wrote to the Rebbe, and he received the reply, and the Rebbe said, you should have the baby and trust in God. So he said, this is the kind of state of mind that Rabbi Kunin found them in when he showed up on the doorstep from the Rebbe. And the man told him, ever since then I've been depressed, I've been tormented, am I making a huge mistake? What's the point of bringing a child into the world if he's going to live such a difficult life right from the get-go? And how can I even expect any kind of positive result? And he said, after we've spoken, after I've understood what Passover is, I'm no longer worried. I know that no matter how dark it gets, God can always redeem me. And Rabbi Kunin, bid them goodbye, and he went to make his own Seder, and he later followed up, and thank God the baby boy, was born sighted, and his two sisters got married and raised families. And that was not exactly a very picturesque Seder, right? With a box of matzah and a couple cups of water. That was all they had. But it was a few Jews trying their best to live the freedom of Passover, to live what Pesach is about, and that was beautiful. So I wish us all, whatever circumstances we're at, to be able to feel the freedom of Pesach. And hopefully, by the time the Seder night comes, we should already be redeemed. We should already be in Yerushalayim with Mashiach, and we could all make a Karban Pesach and celebrate together. So I'm going to wish you all a happy Pesach. I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves, and I'm going to unmute all. Here we go. All right. All right. Any questions, comments? Let's see. Can you unmute yourselves? I think you can.
Dovi, it's Roberta. I have a question.
All right, what's up?
Usually, because this is an unusual Pesach, it's Saturday night, is the first night of Pesach. What do you do about when you hunt for the chametz? Because you can't burn it on Saturday.
So you can't burn it on Saturday, that's correct.
You can't do it until Saturday.
So the search for the chametz, unusually, the search for the chametz is actually on Thursday night. We do it on Thursday night. Okay. We burn the chametz on Friday.
Okay.
Now we're still allowed to eat chametz until Shabbat morning, right? So there's a little paragraph you say. There's a little, the blessing that you say when you burn the chametz. You don't say that blessing, I believe. I'll have to check it up again, but I'm pretty sure you don't. So the search for the chametz with the blessing is on Thursday night, and the burning of the chametz is on Friday. And it's important to have your Shabbat meal before the time when you can no longer eat chametz on Shabbat. I believe my father will be handing out flyers exactly what time that is. It's usually around 10 o'clock or around that time.
Okay. So you search on Thursday. Does that mean no challah for Friday night dinner?
You can have challah. Yes, you can. And you're supposed to, because you're not supposed to eat matzah, because you don't eat matzah until Passover.
Right.
You eat challah. Be very careful not to get the crumbs around, because you just cleaned your house so exhaustively for Pesach. But
so we eat outside, so that's fine.
Yep, that's a very common solution. Thank God the weather's been pretty okay. I mean, actually, I've been coming from New York, so everything is okay over here.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Happy Pesach, Roberta. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else? Let's see on the chat. All right.
Rabbi Dovi,
what's up?
You mentioned eating the egg off of the Seder plate. I have never heard of that. Not that I haven't, there's a lot of things I haven't heard of, but.
Yeah, so it's not, I don't believe it's part of like the halachically mandated part of the Seder, but it is, it's one of the things. In the shul, my mother would put out these little platters of eggs around the beginning of Shulchan Aruch.
It's not the one off the Seder plate.
It's not the one off the Seder plate. Yeah. I don't know if it's necessarily specifically the one off the Seder plate. I mean, that's the one we eat.
Burned.
Huh?
It's not on the
burned or roasted.
Plate.
One more time?
It's usually not of the Seder plate.
Yeah. Either way. But to eat the egg. To eat an egg.
Yeah.
But yep.
Why do we have to do 2 nights when they only do 1 night in Israel?
So this is it's a callback. It's a remnant. When the Jews nowadays we have a Jewish calendar, right? Where all the dates are laid out for us. But in the Jewish calendar, a month could either be 29 days or 30. And nowadays there's a calendar which was pre-calculated how long each month was. But when the Beis HaMikdash, when the Holy Temple was standing, the way it would work is if somebody in Israel would see the new moon, the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. So on the 30th of every month, it's when the moon is at its smallest, the moon disappears. And when you see that sliver of moon beginning to wax again, that means that day is Rosh Chodesh. So Jews would always, when that time of month came around, they would have their eyes peeled looking at the skies. If anybody saw that sliver of moon indicating that it's Rosh Chodesh, he would run to the Jewish court, to the Sanhedrin. They would interrogate him to make sure he actually saw the moon, and they would proclaim that day Rosh Chodesh. So there was an interesting situation in which you can never be sure when Passover or any other holiday fell out, because the previous month could have been 29 days, which would make Passover, 15 days after that, or it could have been 30 days, which means it's going to be the day after. So because there was this uncertain thing, for Jews living in Israel, they were close enough to the court where these decisions were made, that there was a reasonable probability that the news would reach them by the time Passover started. But for Jews who lived outside of Israel, as a precaution, they would have a 2-day Yom Tov as a safety net. It's called Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golias, the second day of the holiday, because of the Golias, of the diaspora. Now, even though nowadays we go by a Jewish calendar, we keep this practice, since it was started by the rabbis, who are very holy men. We keep this practice going nowadays. So in Israel, there's one day that it's not just by Pesach, it's by many holidays. It's by Shavuos and by Sukkot, by Purim, but that's a different reason. That's because it's Shushan Purim. But yeah. So hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? We good? All right. So I'll wish you a l'chaim on this water I have over here, and I'll say Lashana Haba b'Yerushalayim, and Lashana
Next year.
Hazeh this year
Right.
in Yerushalayim. Mordechai, you with me? All right. I'll see you guys later. Have
Bye-bye.
a great night.
Bye.
Chag Sameach.
Goodbye,
Chag
Dovi.
Sameach.
Sameach.